I'm now joined by a man described as the world's hottest deficit hawk. He is Harvard Professor of Economic History and author Niall Ferguson, and one of Time magazine's most influential people. Niall, very good to see you. Thanks so much for coming in today.
Nice to be here.
If we look at the economy at the moment, the argument for stimulus is that it's not strong enough. It's too fragile to take all of this away, an argument you've heard, I'm sure, many times before. But isn't it possible that we will engender a slowdown in growth and a possible double-dip recession?
Well, of course, there is plenty of evidence that that's happening anyway. But I think we have to be very careful here to specify the country we're talking about, because the United States may still have the option of further Keynesian-style stimulus, but really very few other countries have that option. I don't think the UK had that option, which is one reason why George Osborne had to bring out a pretty fiscally tight budget. And of course, Southern Europe clearly doesn't have that option. Really, the only European country that has the option to think in terms of further stimulus is Germany, and the Germans don't want to do it. Interesting.
So why don't you think that the UK had the option? Was it simply because the markets would have punished the UK too much had it not brought in those austerity measures?
The studies were coming out weekly from the International Monetary Fund, from the Bank for International Settlements, saying that of all the developed economies, the UK had the least sustainable fiscal policy, and the numbers were truly frightening. And I think if you sit there hoping that you can get away with it and just carry on borrowing as if there's no tomorrow, well, suddenly tomorrow comes and it's today. That's what the Greeks discovered, and I think the new government understood very well the risks of making the same mistake. So I do think that it's a mistake to imagine that there was a choice open to the UK. The critical question, of course, for the global economy is whether the US can risk further fiscal stimulus. And I think the hardest thing to answer in all of this is timing. At some point, the credibility of US fiscal policy will be called into question, because it's almost as crazy in terms of its future prospects as the fiscal policy of the UK pre the austerity budget. But it's a little hard to know when risk aversion will give way to fears of inflation, fears of even default. That could happen next week, it could happen in 2 years' time. We really don't know, and anybody who claims to know, I think, is bluffing.
Now, when I was talking to George Magnus earlier, he was also talking about timing, and he was saying that as long as you've got a credible plan, he also said it would have been the same in the UK, by the way, that if there was a credible plan, yes, of course you can't just keep on spending and say the deficit's going to go up forever, but that's all you need, is to be able to say, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to do it in 7 years, we're going to do it in 10 years. And there does seem to be an element of sense in that. If you pull a rug away from businesses and allow them to fail now, then that also is storing up problems for the future.
Well, I don't think, in fact, there's a huge difference of opinion on this, even between me and Paul Krugman. I've said all along that the biggest problem with US fiscal policy is that there is simply no plan to return to fiscal stability ever. And if you look at the Congressional Budget Office numbers, what they foresee is deficits for the rest of time. $1 trillion deficits, between 5 and 10% of GDP until the 2083, I think, is the date when they finally give up projecting. Now, that's not credible. I mean, even on a shorter time horizon, you end up with madness like by 2040, on present trends, all federal tax revenues will be absorbed by interest payments. Well, that can't happen, clearly. So I think what's needed here on both sides of the Atlantic is a credible plan in a, let's say, 5 to 10 year time frame. You mentioned 7, if that's George's number, I'm happy with that, which says we are going to get back into fiscal equilibrium. I think that the critical point on which I think we all agree is that really drastic measures now, which damage business confidence, are to be avoided. But remember, not all fiscal retrenchment, not all austerity is bad news for business. Much of what is being planned by George Osborne attacks waste in the public sector. The bloated public sector that the Labour Party allowed to expand is going to feel most of the pain. And that, although it's going to produce all sorts of headlines as the public sector unions whinge, it's good news for business, frankly, because ultimately it's going to reduce the burdens that the private sector has to bear in terms of taxation. And remember, this is a budget that offers a reduction in corporate taxation as part of the package, and I think that has to be good news for confidence.
Now, the reduction in corporate taxation, just one of the things aimed at trying to get companies to spend, and not just here, but globally, there is a concern that companies have got money and it's sitting there and they haven't got the investor confidence to expand their business or to expand elsewhere, to buy other companies. What do you do? What needs to be done to release that money into the business environment?
Well, this is an absolutely crucial question that, for example, Jean-Claude Trichet addressed the other day as President of the European Central Bank. We need private sector confidence to come back, and fiscal measures that bring that about are to be welcomed. I think there's a false dichotomy here between austerity and Keynesianism, because it seems to me that austerity needs to be unpacked. I think there are good and bad versions of austerity. Maybe I don't even like that austerity word at all. The bad version is what you see in Greece at the moment, where the government is cranking up taxes on business, and it seems to me putting itself into a death spiral, trying to balance the budget, but in fact just causing the economy to tank. Good austerity, let's call it prosperity, is something more like the British Conservative Lib Dem budget, which offers encouragement to business and puts the pressure on the public sector. Tackling waste in the public sector has to be good news for business. So I think if you look, for example, at the work of a wonderful economist who we don't hear enough from, Tom Sargent at New York University, there's a very clear lesson of history. If you want business confidence to bounce back, do some radical things that send the kind of signal that the Thatcher government and the Reagan government sent to business in the early 1980s. Now, I think we're sort of halfway there in Britain. We're nowhere near there in the United States, but those are the sorts of measures that we need to see taken. Now, if you do that fiscally, plus, of course, remaining relatively loose on monetary policy, you can get the kind of rebound in growth and in business confidence that we saw in the early 1980s.
Now, you've also been looking backwards, I guess, with your new book. When you are looking at finance and banking, you actually talked a bit about the Hippocratic Oath, and maybe something like it could be used in banking. Do you see banking now as ethically bankrupt?
Well, I certainly think that for many people in the general public, bankers are now at an all-time low in terms of public trust, below even journalists, who traditionally are right at the bottom. And that, of course, is a consequence of, A, the financial crisis, and B, the revelations of grotesque mismanagement and downright fraud that are coming to light. So, not surprisingly, I think there is a need for a radical change in the ethical framework. And one reason I wrote a biography of Sigmund Warburg, the dominant figure in the City of London for the entire post-war period down to his death in 1982, is that he personifies an earlier age when bankers really did have an ethical framework and were morally driven rather than driven just by the quarterly numbers.
OK. Niall Ferguson, thank you so much for joining us. We have to leave it there.
My pleasure.